Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Bedroom Door. Michael Parker woke to the sound of his bedroom door slowly opening. He did not move immediately because he was still caught somewhere between sleep and waking, listening to the faint scrape of wood against carpet, while a narrow strip of darkness appeared between the door and its frame. The landing light was off, leaving the hallway beyond almost completely black, but enough pale light came through Michael's bedroom window for him to see the door continue moving until it had opened perhaps halfway. Someone was standing outside, and for several seconds Michael could make out only the silhouette of a woman in the darkness. Although he could not properly see her face, he recognized the shape of his mother's dressing gown and the familiar way she stood with one hand resting against the doorframe. His first thought was that his parents had returned earlier than expected, although he could not understand why his mother had come into his room without switching on the landing light. Michael pushed himself upright and reached towards the bedside lamp, but before he touched it, his mother calmly said, "Come downstairs a minute." Michael glanced at the clock beside his bed and saw that it was shortly after midnight. He remembered his parents saying they would probably be home around 12, so there was nothing impossible about his mother standing there, yet something about the situation made him leave the lamp switched off. He asked what she wanted, expecting her to mention something they had brought home or perhaps ask for help carrying something from the car, but the woman merely repeated, "Just come downstairs a minute," without moving from the doorway. Her voice sounded like Laura Parker's voice in every way Michael could identify, but the delivery was subtly wrong because his mother would normally have answered his question. She would have told him why she wanted him downstairs, complained that he was still awake, or made some comment about the state of his bedroom, whereas the woman in the doorway had simply repeated herself in almost exactly the same tone. Michael was about to ask what was going on when his phone vibrated on the bedside table, causing the screen to illuminate beside him. He picked it up and saw a message from his mother that read, "Sorry, love, running late. Dad reckons about 20 minutes. You okay?" For several seconds, Michael read the message without understanding what it meant. He checked the contact name, looked at the time, and opened the conversation to make sure he had not somehow read an older message. But the text had arrived only seconds earlier. His parents were still 20 minutes away, which meant the woman standing in his bedroom doorway could not possibly be his mother. Michael slowly raised his eyes towards the landing and found the silhouette exactly where it had been before, with one hand still resting against the frame and her face hidden by the darkness. The woman tilted her head very slightly before asking in his mother's perfectly familiar voice, "Who are you texting?" Michael moved before he had consciously decided what to do, throwing himself out of bed and crossing the room before slamming the door shut with enough force to shake the frame. He immediately turned the small lock beneath the handle and backed away until his legs touched the bed, expecting whoever stood outside to push against the door or attempt to force the handle. Nothing happened, and the silence was somehow worse because the thing outside had allowed him to close the door without resistance. Michael remained staring at the handle until his phone vibrated again with another message from Laura asking whether everything was all right. Michael called her immediately, and Laura answered by asking why he was still awake before the fear in his voice made her stop talking. Michael asked where she was, and after a moment of confusion, Laura told him that she and his father were driving home and were still around 15 minutes away. Michael asked whether she was absolutely certain she had not somehow reached the house already, which prompted Laura to ask what had happened. He told her that someone was inside the house and had been standing outside his bedroom looking and sounding exactly like her, although he knew how ridiculous the statement sounded before he had even finished saying it. Simon Parker was driving beside her, and Michael heard his father asking what was happening. Laura told Simon to call the police while she remained connected to Michael, then asked whether the bedroom door was locked and whether Michael could hear anyone moving outside. When he confirmed that the lock was secure, Laura told him, "Keep the door locked and stay where you are. Do not go downstairs." Less than 3 seconds later, Laura's identical voice repeated from the other side of the bedroom door. "Keep the door locked and stay where you are. Do not go downstairs." Michael stared at the door while Laura fell silent through the phone. She had heard it as clearly as he had, and when she finally asked what the sound had been, Michael whispered that it was her voice. Laura no longer questioned whether fear or confusion had caused him to misunderstand what he had seen, and she told him to move as far from the door as possible while keeping her on speaker. In the background, Simon was giving their address to an emergency operator and explaining that their 17-year-old son was locked inside his bedroom with an unknown intruder somewhere in the house. The handle began moving slowly downwards while Michael watched from beside the bed. It reached the lowest point permitted by the lock and remained there for several seconds before whoever stood outside carefully released it without rattling the mechanism or attempting to force the door. His mother's voice then quietly called Michael's name from the landing, but he refused to answer. After waiting several seconds, the voice told him to open the door because his father was outside, while Laura immediately warned him through the phone that Simon was still sitting beside her in the car. The voice outside tried again, telling Michael that his father needed him downstairs, but Michael remained silent while gripping the heavy metal base of his desk lamp. He knew the object would offer little protection if somebody managed to force the door open, although holding it gave him something physical to concentrate on while Laura continued speaking. Simon's voice eventually came through the phone when Laura placed him on speaker from the car, and his father told him that police were on their way and that he was doing exactly the right thing by staying inside the bedroom. A few seconds after Simon finished speaking, his identical voice came from the landing and calmly told Michael that police were on their way and that he was doing exactly the right thing. Michael looked towards his phone while the real Simon stopped talking and neither parent attempted to explain what they had heard. The voice outside continued using Simon's tone and assured Michael that everything was fine before asking him to unlock the bedroom door. But when Michael refused to respond, the thing outside eventually became quiet. A floorboard creaked on the landing before another responded farther away, allowing Michael to follow the sound of footsteps moving towards his parents' bedroom. A door opened somewhere in the hallway, remained open for several seconds, and then closed again. Laura asked what he could hear, and Michael told her that whatever had been outside seemed to have moved away. She warned him not to unlock the door even if he became convinced the hallway was empty, because neither of them had any way of knowing whether the footsteps were genuine or another attempt to make him believe it was safe. Michael sat on the edge of the bed and watched the narrow gap beneath the bedroom door. For perhaps a minute, nothing moved outside, and he began wondering whether whoever or whatever had entered the house had gone downstairs. Two shadows eventually appeared beneath the door and resembled ordinary feet standing immediately outside, causing Michael to move farther back while his mother's voice returned from the landing. This time, the imitation sounded frightened as it begged Michael to open the door and claimed that something dangerous was downstairs. Laura immediately reminded him through the phone that she was still in the car, but the woman outside continued speaking with increasingly convincing fear. She told Michael that she did not know what had entered the house and pleaded with him to let her inside the bedroom, although the shadows beneath the door never moved. Michael refused to answer, and the voice suddenly changed its approach by mentioning the holiday the Parker family had taken to Cornwall when Michael was 11. It described the tiny cottage where the heating had broken during their first night and repeated the joke Laura had made while they all sat wrapped in blankets in the living room. Michael looked towards his phone and realized that his mother had stopped speaking. Only 4 people had been inside that cottage during the holiday because the trip had taken place before his younger sister became seriously ill. Laura quietly asked whether Michael had ever told anyone else the story, and he said that he had not. The voice outside then laughed softly in exactly the way his mother laughed whenever she remembered something embarrassing before beginning to describe other memories from the Parker family's life. It mentioned the morning Simon accidentally reversed into the garden wall and made Michael promise not to tell Laura until he had worked out how to explain the damage. Simon swore quietly through the phone because he had never discussed that incident with anyone outside the family, yet the entity continued by describing a birthday morning from Michael's childhood and repeating something his father had said while assembling a bicycle in the kitchen. Every memory was correct, and Michael gradually understood that the thing outside was no longer simply trying to convince him that it was one of his parents, because it was demonstrating how much it already knew about them. The shadows beneath the door eventually disappeared, and footsteps moved along the landing before fading towards the staircase. For several minutes, the house became completely silent while Michael remained connected to his parents. Simon spoke intermittently with the police dispatcher using his own phone, and Laura told Michael that officers were approaching from a nearby town while she and Simon were now less than 10 minutes from home. Michael asked whether they should wait somewhere else rather than entering the house themselves, and Laura assured him that they would stop near the end of the street and wait for police. Michael glanced towards the door and wondered whether the thing had finally gone downstairs, but before he could say anything, a young girl's voice quietly spoke from the landing and called him, "Ellie." Michael's entire body tightened at the sound, while Laura made a small, involuntary noise through the phone. Nobody had called Michael by that nickname in 4 years because his younger sister, Amy, had been the only person who continued using it after they were children. Amy had been 9 when she died following an illness that had occupied almost a year of the Parker family's lives. When she was very young, she had struggled to pronounce Michael properly and called him Ellie instead, and although she eventually learned his name, the nickname remained something private between them. The voice outside repeated it in exactly the tone Michael remembered, without sounding older, distorted, or unnatural in any obvious way. Michael stared at the bedroom door while Amy's voice quietly asked, "Can I stay in your room?" Laura began crying through the phone, although she kept her voice controlled enough to tell Michael not to answer. Amy had asked that same question countless times whenever she could not sleep, usually appearing outside Michael's bedroom with a blanket dragging behind her. The imitation then told Michael that their mother had said she could stay, and the ordinary familiarity of the sentence affected him more deeply than anything else the entity had done. Michael covered his mouth with one hand and remained silent while the voice waited outside. It did not scream, threaten him, or become distorted when he refused to respond, but simply called him Ellie once more before footsteps moved quietly away along the landing. Laura apologized through the phone, although Michael did not know what she was apologizing for, and when he asked how something inside the house could possibly know Amy's voice, neither parent attempted to provide an explanation. The silence that followed became almost as frightening as the voices because Michael could no longer determine whether the entity had left, remained motionless outside, or found some other route towards him. He eventually lowered himself beside the bed and looked beneath the door, where 2 shadows had once again appeared on the landing. At first they resembled ordinary feet, but after staring for several seconds, Michael noticed that one shadow extended from a position much farther to the left than the other. The spacing between them was too wide for a person standing normally, and when one shadow shifted slightly, the other remained completely still. Michael immediately stood and backed away, deciding that he would not look beneath the door again. His father's voice soon came from the hallway and urgently told him that something else had entered the house, while the real Simon simultaneously warned him through the phone to ignore whatever was being said. The imitation claimed that Simon had entered through the back door and that something downstairs was pretending to be the family, but Michael understood by then that every new explanation was simply another attempt to make him unlock the bedroom. The entity changed tactics again when Laura's voice spoke from farther along the hallway and warned Michael not to trust the phone. It told him that the people speaking through the device were not really his parents and begged him to listen only to the voice inside the house. Michael kept his attention on the genuine call, while his mother repeatedly reminded him not to answer anything outside, but the entity began repeating her instructions a few seconds after she gave them, sometimes perfectly, and sometimes altering only enough words to reverse their meaning. When Laura told Michael to remain inside his room, the voice outside repeated the instruction almost exactly, but when she warned him not to unlock the door, the imitation calmly told him that he should unlock it. The contradiction made it increasingly difficult to concentrate because the same familiar voice was coming from two places with opposing instructions, and Michael realized that the entity had abandoned the simple attempt to impersonate his mother. It was now deliberately attacking his ability to decide which sounds could be trusted. Several minutes later, everything became quiet again while Michael listened to rain striking the bedroom window and distant tires moving somewhere beyond the house. Laura told him that she and Simon had reached the street and could see police lights approaching from the opposite direction, giving Michael the first genuine sense that the ordeal might soon end. Before he could respond, his own voice whispered from immediately outside the bedroom door and calmly told him not to open it. Michael stared at the handle while hearing his own voice from the landing, and the imitation became even more disturbing when it continued by saying, "It isn't me outside. Don't let me in." The statement contradicted itself so completely that Michael could not understand what response the entity expected, and Laura asked what he was hearing when he stopped speaking. After Michael explained, the thing outside gave a quiet imitation of his laugh before becoming silent again. A car door slammed somewhere outside the house, and Laura confirmed that police had arrived. Michael heard voices near the front entrance, followed by heavy knocking downstairs, and an officer loudly identified himself before instructing anyone inside to make themselves known. Michael remained where he was while the front door opened shortly afterwards, and several sets of footsteps entered the ground floor, with officers calling into each room as they searched the kitchen, living room, and hallway. Laura stayed on the phone and confirmed that she and Simon were outside with another officer, while Michael listened to footsteps begin climbing the staircase. A male voice reached the landing and asked whether Michael Parker was inside the bedroom, but Michael refused to answer because the last hour had taught him that recognizing a voice meant nothing. The officer approached the door and identified himself as P.C. Harris, explaining that Michael's parents were outside and that he was safe, while Laura confirmed through the phone that an officer called Harris had indeed entered the house. Even with that confirmation, Michael refused to unlock the door, and P.C. Harris calmly told him that this was fine. He instructed Michael to remain away from the entrance while police arranged to open the bedroom themselves, but before he could continue, the identical voice of P.C. Harris spoke from somewhere farther along the landing and warned Michael not to open the door because the man standing outside was not really him. The genuine officer stopped speaking immediately. Michael heard him quietly use his radio while another policeman called from downstairs and asked whether everything was all right, and Harris replied that someone else appeared to be upstairs. Several officers searched the landing, bathroom, and bedrooms while Michael remained locked inside, but they found nobody. Harris eventually returned and told Michael through the door that police were going to force the lock themselves, allowing Michael to move to the far side of the room without ever touching the handle. When the bedroom door finally opened, P.C. Harris was standing outside and looked considerably more unsettled than Michael expected from a police officer who had just searched an empty house. The landing behind him was clear, and several other officers were checking rooms farther along the corridor. Police searched the entire property twice, but every exterior door had been locked when they arrived, except the front entrance, which officers had opened using a spare key provided by Laura. The windows were closed. There were no signs of forced entry, and nobody was found inside. Michael left the bedroom only after officers confirmed that every room had been cleared, and Laura reached him at the bottom of the stairs before holding him tightly enough that neither spoke for several seconds. Simon remained beside them while police continued checking cupboards, loft access points, and exterior doors, although nothing suggested that another person had been inside. When Michael eventually asked P.C. Harris whether he had heard the second voice on the landing, The officer hesitated before admitting that he had heard something using his voice from farther along the corridor and could not explain where it had come from. The incident remained officially unresolved because police could find no evidence of an intruder, while the accounts given by Michael, his parents, and P.C. Harris did not fit any conventional explanation. Laura and Simon stayed elsewhere with Michael for several nights, and although the family eventually returned home, Michael never slept in the upstairs bedroom again. His parents did not pressure him to do so because neither of them had forgotten hearing their own voices coming through the phone from inside an empty house. Several weeks later, an officer contacted the family regarding body camera footage recorded during the search, and Michael initially assumed police had found an image of somebody hiding somewhere inside the property. Instead, investigators had noticed something in the audio. The footage showed officers entering the house and beginning their search exactly as Michael remembered, with P.C. Harris moving through the hallway while another officer loudly called, "Police! Make yourself known!" The body camera microphone recorded the officer's sentence clearly, but approximately 2 seconds later, another voice repeated the same words from somewhere upstairs. None of the officers had consciously registered the repetition at the time because several people were speaking and moving through the property. Yet when investigators isolated the recording, the second voice was unmistakable. It belonged to the same officer who had just shouted with almost identical tone and pronunciation, as though something upstairs had heard the sentence and reproduced it within seconds. The footage contained no image of whatever produced the sound, and nothing else recovered from the house explained what Michael experienced that night. He never learned what had stood outside his bedroom, how it had entered a locked property, or why it seemed unwilling to cross the bedroom door without first persuading him to open it. Eventually, Michael stopped trying to understand the rules, because one fact disturbed him more than any explanation he could invent. Whatever had come into the house had known his parents' voices, remembered his dead sister exactly as Michael remembered her, and possessed memories that should have existed only inside the people who had lived through them. Several months later, in a house many miles away with no known connection to the Parker family, a teenage girl woke during the night because her bedroom door was slowly opening. The landing beyond was dark, but enough light entered her room for her to recognize the familiar outline of her father standing quietly outside, and although she could not properly see his face, there was nothing unusual about his voice when he calmly asked her to come downstairs for a minute.